The year 5024 CE was supposed to be a celebration. 3,000 years had passed since the last human fired a weapon in anger. 3,000 years since armies marched across worlds, since children learned to duck at the sound of explosions, since mothers kissed their sons goodbye, not knowing if they would return. Commander Park Jin-woo stood in the memorial gardens of ancient wars on New Seoul, watching a group of 8-year-olds press their small hands against the glass cases. Inside those cases sat the remnants of humanity's violent past: rusted rifles, corroded tank treads, fragments of warships that once brought death across the stars. The children giggled at the strange shapes, unable to understand what these metal objects were meant to do. "Teacher, what's this funny stick?" asked a little girl with bright eyes, pointing at what had once been a pulse rifle capable of cutting through battle armor. "That's a tool from the old days," Jin-woo replied gently. "From when people didn't know how to solve problems with words." The morning air was crisp and clean. New Seoul had been terraformed to perfection over the centuries. No pollution, no crime, no violence. The biggest excitement most people experienced was the annual flower festival, or perhaps a particularly thrilling sports match. Even their sports had evolved beyond physical contact. Everything was civilized, refined, peaceful. Lee De-un, the cultural heritage director, approached with her usual group of alien tourists. Today it was a delegation from the Centaurian worlds, tall, graceful beings with silver skin who had requested to see humanity's primitive artifacts. They moved, with the careful politeness of people viewing a museum of ancient barbarism. "These displays represent humanity's darkest chapter," Da-yun explained in her practiced tour guide voice. "For millennia, our species was trapped in cycles of violence and destruction. We created weapons not just to defend ourselves, but to dominate others. Cities burned, families were torn apart, entire planets became graveyards." One of the Centaurians, his translator device buzzing softly, asked, "How did you overcome such deeply rooted aggression?" Da-un smiled warmly. "We simply grew up. We realized that cooperation brought more benefits than competition. We learned that building was more satisfying than destroying. Our greatest minds turned from creating better weapons to creating better lives." Jin-woo listened to this familiar speech while watching the children. They had moved on to the next display case, where the twisted remains of an ancient battle mech stood like a metal skeleton. To them, it might as well have been a dinosaur fossil, something from a world so distant it felt like mythology. That's when the alarms began. The sound was unfamiliar to most people. For 3,000 years, the emergency broadcast system had been used for weather warnings, asteroid alerts, or the occasional malfunctioning fusion reactor. Never for what came next. Every screen across New Seoul, across every human world, across the entire network of human civilization, displayed the same message. The transmission was crystal clear, translated into every human language simultaneously. The speaker was a being that looked like it had been designed for war. 6 arms, armored carapace, eyes like burning coals. "Humans of the galaxy," the creature announced, its voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I am Supreme War Leader Korth Vax of the Valorian Empire. We represent 7 species who have watched your expansion with growing concern. You spread across the stars like a plague, contaminating other worlds with your presence, claiming territories that belong to the galaxy's rightful rulers." The children in the museum had stopped playing. Even they could sense that something important was happening. Da-yun's alien visitors exchanged worried glances, their silver skin shifting to a darker hue, apparently their species' equivalent of going pale. "Your time of unchallenged growth ends now," the war leader continued. "The Valorian Empire hereby declares total war against humanity. We will cleanse the galaxy of your influence before you become an even greater threat. You have 7 standard days to prepare for extinction." The transmission ended, leaving only silence. In the emergency council chambers on Earth, Prime Administrator Kim Tae-ho stared at the holographic display that showed the scope of the threat. Hundreds of alien warships, each one larger than anything in humanity's civilian fleet, had appeared at the edges of human space. They surrounded colony worlds, trade stations, even Earth itself. The council members sat in stunned silence. Most of them had never seen real violence beyond historical documentaries. Councillor Park Sung-hee, who specialized in agricultural policy, kept staring at her hands as if she couldn't quite process what she'd just heard. Councillor Lim Jae-sung, an expert on interstellar commerce, muttered calculations under his breath about how long their food supplies would last under siege. "What exactly is war?" asked Choi Minji, the youngest member of the council. At 28, she had been elected to represent the perspective of humanity's newest generation. Her question wasn't naive, it was genuinely sincere. The concept of organized violence between civilizations existed only in their history books. Kim Taeho, who at 67 was one of the few people old enough to have spoken with survivors of humanity's last conflicts, tried to find words. War is when different groups try to hurt each other until one side gives up or can't fight anymore. It's when diplomacy fails and people resort to force. But why would anyone want to do that? Minji asked. Wouldn't it be easier to just talk about the problems? Before Taeho could answer, Jin Woo spoke from where he stood near the display screens. His voice was calm, almost thoughtful, but there was something in his expression that made several council members uncomfortable. "I suppose we're about to remember," he said, and his smile was both innocent and deeply unsettling. Something in that smile suggested that perhaps humanity's peaceful nature wasn't quite as complete as everyone believed. The Valorian blockade began at dawn on the second day. Massive alien warships positioned themselves around every major human world, their weapons trained on cities filled with billions of peaceful civilians. The aliens expected chaos, panic, maybe desperate attempts to evacuate. What they got instead was something they couldn't have predicted. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in levels that didn't appear on any official map, something ancient began to wake up. Yoon Seok-jin had worked as keeper of the Central Archives for 30 years, believing his job was simply maintaining humanity's historical records. He catalogued old documents, preserved cultural artifacts, and gave tours to school children who were bored by dusty books about the past. That morning, his computer terminal displayed a message he had never seen before. The text was simple. Priority. Alpha Awakening Protocol initiated. Report to Sub-Level 0 immediately. Seok-jin stared at the screen. In 3 decades of work, he had never heard of a Sub-Level 0. The archives only went down to Sub-Level 12. But as he approached the elevator, he noticed something strange. There was a new button on the panel, one that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. It was unmarked, just a simple black circle at the bottom of the row. When he pressed it, the elevator descended much further than it ever had before. The doors opened onto a corridor that looked like it belonged in a different century. The walls were made of some dark metal, and the air hummed with the sound of machinery that had been running for a very long time. Emergency lights cast red shadows that made everything look like the inside of a beating heart. "You're late," said a voice from the shadows. Kang Hye-jin stepped into the light and Seok-jin's breath caught in his throat. She looked like she was in her 30s, but her eyes were much older. She wore clothing he had never seen before. Not quite military uniform, not quite civilian clothes, but something that suggested both purpose and danger. "I've been asleep for 3,000 years, she continued, stretching her arms as if working out the stiffness from the longest nap in human history. The pods kept us in perfect condition, rotating us in shifts so someone would always be ready when the time came." "The time for what?" Seok-jin managed to ask. Hye-jin smiled, and it was. Nothing like the gentle smiles he was used to seeing on human faces. This smile had teeth in it. The time to remember who we really are. She led him through corridors filled with technology that definitely hadn't existed 3,000 years ago. People emerged from other passages, men and women who moved with a confidence that seemed almost predatory. They nodded to Hye-jin with the respect given to someone who had earned their position through more than just appointment. "We are the Guardians," she explained as they walked. "The children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of humanity's last warriors. While everyone else was learning to live in peace, we were learning to preserve the capacity for war. Not because we wanted to use it, but because we knew that someday someone would force us to." On the agricultural world of Harmony Station, Nam Dong-hyun was having the strangest morning of his life. He had gone to sleep as a simple engineer whose biggest concern was optimizing crop yields for the winter season. He woke up with knowledge, flooding his brain, information about weapons, tactics, and manufacturing processes that he definitely hadn't learned in engineering school. The farming equipment around him suddenly looked different. The same machines that harvested grain could be reconfigured to produce something much more dangerous. His hands moved with practiced skill as he began making modifications, while his mouth hummed a song he had never heard before, but somehow knew by heart. Strange, he muttered to himself as he converted a fertilizer dispenser into something that could launch projectiles at incredible speeds. It's like remembering something I never learned. Similar scenes were playing out across human space. On research stations, in manufacturing centers, in the homes of ordinary citizens, people were discovering that their peaceful civilization had hidden depths. Song Ji-hoon had spent 40 years in his laboratory, working on what his colleagues called theoretical combat applications, mathematical models for hypothetical conflicts that everyone assumed would never happen. When the first Valorian scout ships approached his research station, Ji-hoon activated systems that had been disguised as atmospheric processors, mining equipment, and communication arrays. The aliens found themselves facing defensive capabilities that seemed to predict their every move, as if someone had been planning for this exact situation for centuries. The Valorian war leader Korth Vax received the first battle reports with growing confusion. His scouts reported that human civilian installations were responding to attacks with military precision. Cargo ships were launching weapons that shouldn't have existed. Mining colonies were deploying shield systems that rivaled military fortifications. "How is this possible?" he demanded of his intelligence officers. "Our agents confirmed that humans had no military capability. They haven't fought a war in 3 millennia. But the most disturbing reports came from his psychological warfare specialists. Humans weren't responding to the threat of war with the terror and desperation that most species showed when faced with extinction. Instead, they seemed almost excited. On New Seoul, Jin-woo had requested to address the civilian population. As he stood before the cameras, broadcast to billions of humans across the galaxy, his demeanor was calm but electric with anticipation. "My fellow humans," he began, "we stand at a crossroads. For 3,000 years, we have lived in peace, building a civilization based on cooperation and understanding. But peace was never weakness. Peace was preparation." His smile was the same unsettling expression he had worn in the council chambers, but now it seemed to make more sense. Our ancestors didn't abandon the art of war when they achieved peace. They perfected it, they hid it. They preserved it for the day when someone would force us to remember what we were capable of. That day has arrived. Across human space, ordinary citizens began to understand that their peaceful lives had been built on foundations they had never imagined. The farmers who fed the galaxy had been trained to feed armies. The engineers who built their cities could build weapons. The teachers who educated their children had been passing down lessons that went much deeper than literature and mathematics. The Valorians had expected to find a soft, defenseless civilization. Instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping, dreaming, and planning for 3,000 years. And that something was very happy to finally have a chance to stretch its muscles. As reports flooded in from across the galaxy, one thing became clear. Humanity's long peace hadn't made them weak. It had given them time to become something much more dangerous than their ancestors had ever been, and they were just getting started. The Valorian strike force approached the mining colonies of the Outer Rim with the confidence of predators stalking helpless prey. These were the furthest human settlements, isolated worlds where families scraped ore from asteroids and lived simple lives far from the protection of major military installations. At least, that's what the Valorian intelligence reports claimed. War Commander Thek-vor led 12 heavy cruisers toward the mining station at Prosperity Point, expecting to find panicked civilians begging for mercy. Instead, his tactical display showed something impossible. The mining station's atmospheric processors were rotating to face his fleet, and energy readings suggested they were charging weapons that shouldn't exist. Lim Subin sat in what everyone had always assumed was the station's environmental control center. For 15 years, she had been the colony administrator, handling supply schedules, resolving disputes between miners, and making sure everyone had enough air to breathe. What nobody knew was that she had also been maintaining defensive systems that had been built into the station's infrastructure from the very beginning. "Atmospheric processor number 4 online," she announced calmly to her staff, most of whom were discovering for the first time that their workplace was actually a military fortress. "Targeting solution acquired. Defensive posture initiated." The miners around her stared in amazement as their familiar workplace transformed. The walls slid back to reveal targeting computers that had been hidden behind decorative panels. The coffee machine, of all things, opened up to display a communications array that connected directly to Earth's strategic command. Su Bin's hands moved across controls she had never touched, but somehow knew how to operate. "Incoming transmission from Valorian fleet," she reported. "They're demanding our immediate surrender." She smiled as she opened a channel to respond. "This is Administrator Su Bin of Prosperity Point. We decline your kind offer." The first Valorian attack came exactly as Su Bin had predicted it would. The hidden defensive systems, disguised as ordinary mining equipment for decades, responded with surgical precision. Energy beams that had been designed to cut through asteroids found new targets in Valorian hull plating. The mining stations or processing facilities revealed themselves as sophisticated weapons factories that had been preparing for this moment for generations. On Earth, Bai Wujin watched the battle unfold from the newly activated Strategic Command Center. Until yesterday, he had been a professor of theoretical mathematics at Seoul University. Today, he was coordinating humanity's military response across dozens of star systems, using knowledge that seemed to have awakened in his mind overnight. "Patch me through to the Valorian command frequency," he ordered. His technicians, many of whom had been librarians and teachers just hours before, worked with the efficiency of seasoned military personnel. The transmission reached War Commander Thekvor just as his third cruiser exploded under the precise fire of what he had assumed was a defenseless mining station. "Valorian forces," Wujin's voice was calm, almost conversational. "This is Strategic Coordinator Bai Wujin, representing human interests. You've declared war using your understanding of conflict. Allow us to demonstrate ours." The tone was polite, but something in it made the Valorian commander's blood run cold. At Crossroads Station, the galaxy's busiest trade hub, and Yejin was, discovering that her job as traffic coordinator had prepared her for something much more complex than managing cargo shipments. The same skills that let her route thousands of vessels through busy space lanes were now being applied to something called tactical fleet management. The Valorians had studied Crossroads Station for years, dismissing its elaborate architecture as typical human obsession with unnecessary decoration. The flowing curves and artistic spires were pretty to look at, but served no practical purpose. Or so they thought. When their attack fleet arrived, those decorative elements revealed their true nature. The artistic spires were actually sensor arrays that had been mapping every ship that passed through the system for decades. The flowing curves were weapon emplacements that could target vessels from angles that traditional military designers would never consider. "Valorian fleet, this is Crossroads Control," Yejin announced as her station's hidden weapons powered up. "You are in violation of commercial shipping lanes. Please adjust your course immediately or face standard traffic penalties." The standard traffic penalties turned out to be weapons systems that used the Valorians' own tactical information against them. Every ship in their fleet had been scanned, analyzed, and catalogued during previous visits to the station. The Eidma humans knew exactly where their weapons were located, how their shields operated, and what their weak points were. The battle was less like a military engagement and more like a precisely choreographed dance. Human defensive systems would fire exactly enough shots to disable a Valorian weapon, then wait to see how the aliens responded before taking the next measured step. On New Busan, Commander Hwang Min-seo watched her defense fleet engage the Valorian. Advance force with the same methodical precision being demonstrated across human space. Her ships moved with perfect coordination, each one responding to Valorian attacks with exactly the right amount of force needed to neutralize the threat. "Commander," asked her tactical officer, "shouldn't we press our advantage? We could destroy their entire fleet." Mincio shook her head. "Our ancestors learned an important lesson through centuries of warfare. Overwhelming force breeds resentment and creates enemies who will never forgive you. Measured superiority breeds respect and creates opportunities for peace." She gestured to the tactical display, where human ships were systematically disabling Valorian vessels without destroying them. "We're not trying to humiliate them, we're trying to educate them." The pattern repeated across every battlefield. Human forces would analyze their opponent's capabilities, then deploy exactly enough countermeasures to achieve victory with minimal casualties on both sides. It was warfare elevated to the level of science, with each engagement serving as both a tactical victory and a demonstration of human restraint. War leader Korth Vax received reports from his commanders with growing disbelief. Every attack had been repelled, but not through overwhelming firepower. Instead, humans seemed to be fighting with a level of precision that made his own military strategies look primitive by comparison. "How are they doing this?" he demanded of his intelligence officers. "They haven't fought a war in 3,000 years. The answer came from his chief analyst, whose voice trembled with a mixture of fear and respect. "Sir, I believe they've been preparing for this exact war for 3,000 years. Every human installation we've studied, every civilian facility we've dismissed as harmless, appears to have been designed with military applications in mind." The Valorian Empire had expected to crush a weak, peaceful civilization. Instead, they had awakened something that had been quietly perfecting the art of warfare while they were still learning to use crude weapons. The humans weren't just defending themselves, they were giving their enemies a masterclass in military strategy, and they were doing it with the patience of teachers who had been waiting a very long time for the right students to arrive. On the Thai, peaceful colony world of Haven, Jang Hyunwoo was having the most extraordinary day of his teaching career. For 8 years, he had worked with kindergarten children, leading them through games that developed their coordination and problem-solving skills. Today, he discovered that those innocent playground activities had been preparing his students for something much more significant. "All right, children," he announced to his class of 26 5-year-olds, "today we're going to play the flying game for real." The children cheered with excitement. They loved the flying game, a complex activity where they worked together to control tiny hovering objects through obstacle courses. What they didn't know was that those toys were actually military-grade. Reconnaissance drones and the obstacle courses were replicas of real battlefield conditions. Little Park Min-ho, barely 6 years old, raised his hand. "Teacher, why are there big scary ships in the sky today?" Hyunwoo smiled gently. "Those ships belong to people who want to play a different kind of game with us. But don't worry, we've been practicing for this game our whole lives." He activated the classroom's hidden systems, and the walls slid away to reveal banks of control interfaces. The children settled into positions they had practiced hundreds of times, their small hands moving across controls with the natural ease of those who had never known these activities weren't normal childhood games. Within minutes, swarms of tiny drones launched from hidden bays throughout the colony. The approaching Valorian ground forces found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't even see. Thousands of palm-sized robots that moved with perfect coordination, gathering intelligence, and disrupting their advance with surgical precision. "Teacher," called out young Kim Soo-jin, "the bad ships are trying to land near the playground. Should we make them go away?" Hyunwoo checked his tactical display, information flowing to him through channels he had never consciously learned to access. "Yes, dear. Use Formation 7, the one we practiced last week." The children worked together with the unconscious teamwork of a sports team, their drone swarms shifting into complex patterns that confused and misdirected the alien landing craft. What the Valorians perceived as sophisticated military resistance was actually being coordinated by children who thought they were playing the most exciting game of their lives. Meanwhile, on Earth, Moon So-young was overseeing the transformation of New Tokyo's famous entertainment district. As the city's director of public recreation, She had spent years ensuring that citizens had access to the best amusements and diversions. Now she was discovering that every roller coaster, every holographic theater, every transport tunnel had been designed with a secondary purpose. The massive holographic displays that usually showed fantasy adventures and sporting events flickered and changed, revealing detailed tactical maps of the entire solar system. The underground transport networks that moved millions of tourists each day revealed additional pathways that could rapidly deploy personnel and equipment to strategic locations. Incredible, So Young muttered as she watched the entertainment complex reshape itself around her. We built the most elaborate military command center in human history, and we disguised it as an amusement park. The irony wasn't lost on her. Millions of people had come to New Tokyo seeking fun and relaxation, never realizing they were visiting what was essentially a massive military installation. The carousel had been scanning for electromagnetic signatures. The haunted house attraction had been training civilians in stress response and tactical thinking. Even the cotton candy vendors had been part of an intelligence network that monitored visitor behavior patterns. Across the galaxy, Valorian High Command was struggling to understand what they were facing. War leader Korth Vax studied battle reports. That made no logical sense. Human military responses weren't just effective, they were prophetic. Every Valorian tactical decision seemed to have been anticipated and countered before it was even implemented. "How are they doing this?" demanded Fleet Commander Yexthar, his forearms gesticulating wildly. "They're responding to strategies we haven't even deployed yet." The answer came from an unexpected source. Shin Dong-wan, leading human forces in the contested Proxima sector, had opened a direct communication channel to the Valorian command. "Ship, respected enemies," his voice was formal but friendly. "You seem confused by our tactical responses. Allow me to clarify. We have been studying your species for approximately 2,000 years. Your military doctrine, your technological capabilities, your psychological profiles, all of this information has been carefully gathered and analyzed." The Valorian commanders exchanged horrified glances. 2,000 years was longer than their recorded history, Dongwan continued. "Your attack patterns follow logical progressions based on your biological imperatives and cultural values. We have run simulations of this exact conflict 847,000 times, with variations accounting for different possible approaches you might take. You are currently following scenario number 23,191. The implications hit the aliens like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't just been preparing for war in general. They had been preparing for war against the Valorians specifically, for longer than Valorian civilization had existed. From her position as humanity's newly revealed chief military philosopher, Go Yun-seo addressed the Valorian Empire directly. Her broadcast reached every ship in their fleet, every command center, every leader who had participated in the decision to attack humanity. "Esteemed Valorian warriors," she began, her tone carrying the respect of one professional addressing another, "you have given us something precious beyond measure. For 3 millennia, our military theorists have developed strategies, tactics, and technologies that existed only in simulation and hypothesis. You have provided us with the opportunity to test these theories in practice." Her smile was visible even across the vast distances of space, transmitted through quantum communication arrays that the Valorians were only now realizing had been monitoring their every move for centuries. "For this gift," she continued, "we are genuinely grateful. You have allowed us to discover whether our preparations were adequate. The results, as you can observe, suggest they were more than sufficient." On Meridian Prime, the most heavily contested world in the conflict, Lee Jae-hoon was deploying technologies that seemed to defy the Valorians' understanding of physics, weapons that bent space-time to strike targets that were technically behind cover, defense systems that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, energy fields that converted incoming attacks into power for human systems. The Valorian ground commander, veteran of dozens of planetary invasions, found his forces facing defenses that operated on principles he couldn't comprehend. His energy weapons were absorbed and redirected. His kinetic projectiles were deflected by barriers that seemed to exist only when needed. His electronic warfare systems encountered countermeasures that appeared to think faster than his computers. Could process. "What are these humans?" he whispered to his tactical officer, watching his most advanced military technology being casually neutralized by what appeared to be ordinary civilian installations. The answer was becoming clear across the galaxy. Humanity's 3,000 years of peace hadn't been a period of stagnation or weakness. It had been the longest military preparation in galactic history. While other species had focused on immediate threats and short-term conflicts, humans had been quietly developing capabilities that transcended the very concept of warfare as their enemies understood it. They weren't just fighting a war. They were demonstrating that war itself had evolved beyond anything the galaxy had previously imagined. The siege of Kronos began on a Tuesday morning with what the Valorians would later describe as the most polite military assault in galactic history. Park So-jin led the human forces surrounding the fortress world, but instead of the devastating bombardment that Valorian military doctrine expected, something far more unsettling occurred. "Attention, defenders of Kronos," So-jin's voice carried across all communication frequencies, with the calm professionalism of someone announcing a scheduled maintenance procedure. "We are here to disable your military capabilities. Please evacuate non-combatants to designated safe zones. We will wait for your compliance before beginning operations." The Valorian fortress commander, Grak Thos, stared at his communication console in bewilderment. In 40 years of military service, he had never encountered an enemy that gave advance warning of their attacks, complete with evacuation schedules and safety protocols. "Is this some kind of psychological warfare?" he asked his officers. The answer came 6 hours later, when human forces began their assault. Every weapon they deployed was designed to disable rather than destroy. Energy beams that shut down power systems without damaging life support. Projectiles that specifically targeted weapons arrays while leaving crew quarters untouched. Even their boarding parties carried equipment designed to safely extract Valorian personnel from damaged vessels. So-jin coordinated the siege from her command ship, watching the tactical displays with the focused attention of a surgeon performing very delicate operation. Each strike was precisely calculated to achieve maximum military effect with minimum casualties. Her forces didn't just defeat the Valorian defenses, they dismantled them with surgical precision, the way a skilled mechanic might disassemble an engine to understand how it worked. "Target their shield generators," she instructed her weapons. "Teams. Disable, don't destroy. We want to study their shielding technology afterward." The Valorian defenders found themselves facing an enemy that seemed more interested in capturing their equipment intact than in killing them. Human forces would breach their defensive positions, then immediately begin providing medical aid to wounded Valorians, while simultaneously cataloging their weapons and tactical systems. 3-star systems away, Ryu Min-ho was conducting surrender negotiations with the Valorian Third Fleet in a conference room aboard the human vessel Harmony's Edge. The setting was deliberately chosen, a comfortable space with soft lighting, refreshments and chairs designed for various alien physiologies. It looked more like a business meeting than a military surrender. Fleet Commander Zekvor sat across from Minho, his 6 arms folded in a posture that conveyed both defeat and confusion. "Your terms are unusually generous," he said, reviewing the surrender document. "You're offering medical treatment for our wounded, safe passage for our civilian vessels, and guaranteed prisoner rights that exceed even our own military standards." Minho nodded, pouring tea for both himself and his alien counterpart. "We bear you no hatred, Commander. You've simply provided us with an interesting problem to solve. Now that we've solved it, there's no reason for continued hostility." The Valorian commander's translator device struggled with the concept. "Problem to solve? We declared war on your entire species." "Yes," Minho replied with a slight smile, "and it was quite an engaging challenge. We've learned a great deal about multi-species coalition warfare, the effectiveness of intimidation tactics, and the psychological impact of perceived strength versus actual capability. Your empire's approach to conflict provided us with invaluable data." Zekvor realized with growing horror that the humans viewed this entire war as an intellectual exercise. They weren't fighting out of anger, fear, or territorial ambition. They were fighting because someone had presented them with a fascinating puzzle to solve. On the agricultural world of New Harmony, Kim Da-young coordinated the distribution of humanitarian aid to Valorian colonies that had been cut off from their supply lines during the conflict. The operation was managed with the same methodical efficiency that human forces had demonstrated in dismantling Valorian military infrastructure. Supply ships arrived precisely on schedule, carrying not just basic necessities but luxury items that many Valorian civilians had never experienced. Medical teams provided treatments for conditions that had nothing to do with the war, simply because they noticed the problems and had the capability to help. Construction crews repaired damage to civilian infrastructure that had occurred during the fighting, often improving the original designs in the process. "Why are you helping us?" asked a Valorian colony administrator as he watched human engineers upgrading their power grid beyond pre-war specifications. Da-young consulted her tablet, checking off items on what appeared to be an endless list of aid distributions. "Because you need help, and we have the resources to provide it. The fact that we were recently in conflict doesn't change our obligation to prevent unnecessary suffering." The administrator stared at her in confusion. "But we're your enemies." "Were," Da-young corrected gently. "Past tense. The conflict is over. Now you're simply people who need assistance." Meanwhile, Oh Seung-hwan was documenting every aspect of the war with the thoroughness of a scholar, preparing the definitive historical account. His team of researchers accompanied human forces to every battlefield, recording tactics, analyzing alien technology, and interviewing participants from both sides. The Valorian approach to fleet coordination shows interesting parallels to the Centaurian wars of the 23rd century, he noted in his daily report, but with modifications that suggest cultural adaptation over approximately 1,500 years of military evolution. Valorian prisoners found themselves being interviewed by human researchers who showed genuine curiosity about their military traditions, their strategic thinking, and their personal experiences as soldiers. The humans took detailed notes, asked follow-up questions, and treated the entire process like an academic conference rather than an interrogation. "You're studying us," observed Valorian War Captain Thexmore during one such interview. Seung-hwan nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Your empire represents the most sophisticated multi-species military alliance we've encountered in our historical records. The way you coordinate forces from 7 different worlds, each with unique physiological and cultural characteristics, is remarkable. We're learning tremendously from this experience." The captain's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching existential dread. "We're not your enemies, we're your research subjects." "Why not both?" Seung-hwan replied cheerfully, making another note in his tablet. "The two categories aren't mutually exclusive." As reports filtered back to the Valorian High Command, a terrifying picture emerged. Humanity wasn't just winning the war, they were treating it as an educational opportunity. Every battle was being analyzed, every tactic catalogued, every cultural interaction studied for future reference. The humans were building a comprehensive database of Valorian civilization while simultaneously dismantling it. War leader Korth Vax sat in his command chamber, surrounded by reports of defeats that read more like scientific papers than military briefings. His intelligence officers had compiled a disturbing pattern. Human forces were capturing Valorian technology, studying their tactical responses, and documenting their cultural practices with the systematic thoroughness of anthropologists studying a newly discovered civilization. "They're not trying to destroy us," he whispered to his aide. "They're trying to understand us." The aide, a veteran of dozens of galactic conflicts, nodded grimly. "In some ways, sir, that's far more terrifying than simple conquest. They're treating our entire civilization like a specimen to be examined." The truth was becoming undeniable across the Valorian Empire. Humanity hadn't welcomed war because they were aggressive or militaristic. They had welcomed it because they were supremely confident in their ability to control its outcome. They were fighting not with hatred, but with curiosity, not for conquest, but for knowledge. And that clinical, intellectual approach to warfare was proving more psychologically devastating than any amount of physical destruction could have been. The final meeting took place aboard the Valorian flagship Eternal Dominion, in a chamber that had once hosted the war councils of 7 different species. Now it served as the setting for the most unusual surrender ceremony in galactic history. Han Ji-soo entered the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of this conflict. The Valorian High Council sat in their traditional circle, but their usual aggressive postures had been replaced by something closer to exhausted bewilderment. These were beings who had conquered dozens of worlds, who had built an empire through superior firepower and tactical brilliance. Yet they had been outmaneuvered at every turn by a species they had dismissed as soft and unprepared. Ji-soo took her place at the center of the circle, not as a conqueror claiming victory, but as a teacher addressing students who had failed to understand an important lesson. Her expression was gentle, almost sympathetic, as she looked at each council member in turn. "Your mistake," she began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustic systems, "was assuming that peace made us weak. You saw 3,000 years of tranquility and concluded that we had forgotten how to fight. But our peace was possible precisely because we never forgot the lessons of war. We simply evolved beyond your understanding of them." Supreme War Leader Korth Vax, his 6 arms trembling with barely contained rage, spoke through gritted teeth. "You deceived us. Your entire civilization is built on lies." Ji-soo shook her head. "Not lies. Preparation. Every human child who played in our parks was learning skills they might someday need. Every engineer who built our cities was also designing defensive systems. Every teacher who educated our young was preserving knowledge that peace made dormant but never destroyed." She gestured to the chamber around them, where Valorian military banners hung like defeated ghosts. "You studied us for years before attacking. You catalogued our trade routes, analyzed our industrial capacity, assessed our defensive capabilities. What you failed to understand was that we were studying you just as carefully, and we had been doing it for much longer." Lee Sung-min stepped forward, carrying the formal documents that would end this conflict. As humanity's chief diplomatic representative, he had spent the past week crafting terms that were both generous and absolute in their implications. "The Valorian Empire faces a choice," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Integration into human civilization with full rights, full protection, and full participation in our society. Your cultures will be preserved, your people will be welcome, and your knowledge will enrich our collective understanding of the galaxy." He paused, allowing the first option to settle before continuing. "Alternatively, you may return to your territories and resume your previous way of life, but under humanity's oversight. We will ensure that conflicts like this one never occur again, whether they originate from your empire or threaten it from outside sources." The council members exchanged glances, communicating in the rapid hand signals that served as their species. Silent language. Finally, Supreme Commander Thokvarin, the architect of their war strategy, asked the question that had been haunting the Valorian leadership since their first defeat. "How long have you been preparing for this specific conflict?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Yo Hai-jin, the eldest of the Guardians, had remained silent throughout the formal proceedings. Now she stepped forward, her ancient eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of 3 millennia. "Since the day we achieved peace," she said, her voice carrying the weight of ages, "we began preparing for the day we might need to defend it. Your species first appeared in our long-range surveys 2,147 years ago. We have been modeling your technological development, your cultural evolution, and your likely expansion patterns ever since." The Valorian Council sat in stunned silence as the implications hit them. Humanity had been preparing for this war since before the Valorian Empire had even formed its first interstellar government. Hai-jin continued, "We identified 847 potential threat scenarios across 23 different species or species coalitions. The Valorian Empire represented scenario number 12, a mid-level challenge that would require approximately 15% of our total defensive capability to resolve." Thokvarin's translator device struggled with the mathematics before finally displaying the terrifying truth. Humanity had defeated their greatest military effort while barely exerting itself. "How you never took us seriously," he whispered. "On the contrary," Ji-soo replied, "we took you very seriously indeed. seriously enough to prepare for 2,000 years, seriously enough to redesign our entire civilization around the possibility that someday someone would force us to remember what we were capable of. The surrender ceremonies concluded with a formality that felt almost anticlimactic after the scope of what had been revealed. Documents were signed, territories were negotiated, and the future relationship between the two civilizations was carefully defined. But the real conclusion had already occurred, the moment when the Valorian Empire understood that they had never been fighting a war at all. They had been participating in a test. Back on New Seoul, Commander Park Jin-woo walked through the memorial gardens of ancient wars, as he had done every morning for years. But today the exhibits were different. New display cases had appeared overnight, containing artifacts from humanity's recent campaign. The weapons were elegant, the defensive systems sophisticated, the tactical documents already being studied. By graduate students in military philosophy, children pressed their faces against the glass, just as they always had, but now their questions were different. "Teacher Jinwoo," asked a little girl with bright, curious eyes, "will there be another war someday?" Jinwoo smiled, the same unsettling expression that had marked the beginning of this entire conflict. "Possibly, dear one. But if there is, we'll be ready for it too." He made his final entry in the memorial's daily log, a tradition he had maintained for 8 years of peaceful mornings. Today's entry was brief but significant. Peace has been restored. The students are taking notes. Across the galaxy, humanity's smile was finally understood. It hadn't been a welcome for war, but satisfaction at finally having the opportunity to demonstrate what 3 millennia of patient, careful, systematic preparation had achieved. The galaxy's most peaceful civilization had revealed itself to be its most formidable military power, not through aggression or conquest, but through the simple application of superior preparation. The lesson was clear. Never assume that those who choose peace have forgotten how to fight. Sometimes they've simply become too good at it to need to prove anything, until someone forces them to.